Hello, how are you? We're here, it's Wednesday again, and my daily weather watch, well, weekly weather watch, really. it's an alright day. There's blue skies and clouds, and we're all good. It's not raining, it's quite dry out there. So, how are you? We're all sort of getting ready for Christmas. We haven't put our decorations up yet. We don't do that until December. But there's seeing lots of people putting their Christmas decorations up, and it's been a strange year. It's really an odd year. Well, Christmas seems to have come around really quick, and yet we seem to have spent most of it in lockdown. And well, there we are. I've had a question from one of the people who listened to my should we celebrate Halloween or not? And it's a question which has perturbed me. It's the question was, should I tell my daughter, my little girl, about Father Christmas, because I don't want to lie to her. And I was like, oh, that's a difficult one. So I'm probably going to do a video on the origins of Christmas and whether we should talk about Father Christmas or not. It's a rather strange one, and for my point of view, we always sing Happy Birthday to Jesus after our Sunday meal, after our Christmas meal, and some of you may think that's nuts, some of you may think that's nice. It's our way of giving recognition that the whole day is Jesus' day, and whether or not he was born on that day, we don't know, but it's a recognition of that. And we I don't know whether I've told you this story. We had Caleb's girlfriend over for dinner last Christmas, and he told her that we do this, but she didn't believe him. So when Andrea brings the chocolate log out with birthday candles on and we sing Happy Birthday to Jesus, she was staggered and she didn't know where to look and what to do. But it was really funny, the look on her face. Well, we are in the middle of Jeremiah, and we've sort of gone through part of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah was talking about when you turn away from God, you turn away from goodness of life, and the bad side comes to the surface. And we'd seen him talk about the priests and the prophets and the princes and everybody, and what they'd done wrong, because we are basically and this is a weird thing to say, we're basically evil, even if we know how to do good things. And that the premise of this is when Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were pure good. And when they ate of the apple, they took evil into themselves. So any pot of white paint that you put a drop of black in will never be white again. So we are the pots of white paint that the enemy has dropped black paint in, and so we are tainted, and that's the basis of saying we're basically evil. We're a grey, and as Paul puts it in Romans 1, when men give up God, God gives up men, and that in a sense was what Jeremiah was saying. And when God gives up men, the worst side of them comes out to the surface, and bad things come out of society, and we are seeing that at the moment in our society, because there are more and more people giving up God. And we all know that, but there for the grace of God, we would be much worse than we are. And when we read about all these bad things people do, we are just as capable of doing them and being just like that, given the right circumstances and the right pressures. So we have an apostate people. Apostate, which I should have mentioned last time, means a person or a people who abandon their religion. And the second major theme that is like other prophets is this is bound to lead to disaster. God has asked to do something about this, and he cannot allow his people to go on like this. So he's said he's going to bring the Babylonians. Those who say that Jeremiah is all bad news haven't read him properly, because he looks into the future, and he has a lovely optimism about the restoration of God's people. Jeremiah 31:31 to 34 says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbour and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. But many readers stop there. Let's read on a bit. Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and the stars by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar, The Lord of hosts is his name. If this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then shall the offspring of Israel cease from being a nation from before me forever. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens can be measured, and the foundations of the earth below can be explored, then I will cast the offspring of Israel for all that they have done, declares the Lord. Here, God is basically guaranteeing that he will keep his side of the covenant and there will always be an Israel. And the fact that the name Israel is back on the map today is proof of God's promise. There will always be an Israel because God promised that as long as the sun and the moon and the stars are up there, then Israel would be down here. This is the ultimate restoration of his people. And if you read the previous chapter, it's all about bringing his people home again. And they'll come rejoicing and dancing, and they'll come home again. Well, he promised to bring them back, although it was Jeremiah who said it was going to be 70 years. And many years later, Daniel read that in exile, and he realized that the 70 years was nearly up. And so he was excited because Jeremiah had said it would be 70 years, and they were nearly through. God was assuring that the land got its rest, and assuring that the generation that had left the land had died and they couldn't come back. God only promised to bring their children back, and those children had been born in Babylon. They had never seen their own land. But there's a whole emphasis in chapter 30 on bringing them home, bringing his people back home. And that's a magic word, home. It's where we belong, where we've come from, and it's sort of our origin. But he promised them a new leader, a new king, and he gave this new leader a lot of titles: the Good Shepherd, the Righteous Branch, the Messianic Prince, the Shoot of David, and the Fountain of Life. He talked about the coming king in these beautiful terms, and he also promised that this man would come and restore the throne to them, the ultimate restoration. The fourth and last point that he makes, that the other prophets made, is that their enemies would be punished. The Babylonians would be punished. All who'd been against Israel would be punished. The Babylonians were allowed to take them off, but they would be punished for it. Habakkuk made this point in particular. All Israel's enemies, God will avenge his people on them. There's actually a list of them: Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Damascus, Syria. Damascus is Syria. Kedar, Hadzor, Elam, and last of all, Babylon. And Jeremiah promises that one day Babylon will be conquered by another world power. We now know it was going to be Persia. And that conquest of Babylon by Persia would mean the release of the Jews to go back home. Because Cyrus... Excuse me a minute. Sorry about that. I thought that he was going to keep on knocking forever. And Jeremiah promises that one day Babylon will be conquered by another world power. We know it was going to be Persia, but they didn't know that then. And that conquest of Babylon by Persia would mean the release of the Jews to go back home. Because Cyrus, their leader, was a very benevolent leader, and he wanted to send the people who had been brought to Babylon back home. Jeremiah doesn't tell us this, but we can find it out in other books. Cyrus sent everyone back to their own land, and he said to be sure to build a temple to your God, which you can pray for me in it. And he actually funded the building of these temples as well. And he said this to every captive people, but it meant that to the Jews. And the Jews had the authority to rebuild their temple in their own land. And so Jeremiah was a prophet to the nations. And there's a whole lot, there's a whole section at the end of his book that predicts what would happen to all the nations who had attacked Israel. And it's God who will wreak his vengeance on them, not Israel. The Jews, therefore, would need to leave Babylon. They must stay there when they mustn't stay there when they could come home. But only 50,000 out of approximate 1 million people actually came home. And to this day, Jews who've stayed in Iraq and Iran have a very difficult time there. And to leave all that you've spent years building up, to return home, to a home that you've never known, must have been difficult. And basically to do what Abraham did, when Abraham was in roughly the same area, God told him, pick up everything and leave and go to this new land. And it's not an easy thing to do. But God told them through Jeremiah, be sure you come back. We are now going to look at the whole structure of Jeremiah, just to see how that message that he has in common with other prophets is laid out. And we will get an overall shape of the book. Jeremiah is a bit of a jumble, and it's not in chronological order. Nevertheless, there is a pattern which you can see. Initially, we start with the prologue, and that's in chapter 1. And it's his personal call, how he has been called by God. He was called as a teenager, as we've said, and he was afraid of public speaking, and basically being called to be a prophet when you're afraid of public speaking is a bit of a problem. And then in chapters 2 to 45, we cover the sinning nation, his nation of Judah. And there's an immediate retribution in chapters 2 to 20. He's saying that this retribution is coming very quickly, and it covers the years 627 to 605 BC. And it's mainly poetry, communicating God's feelings to them, God's regret and his anger. And it's a conflict of emotions. He loves them, but he cannot allow them to go on as they are. Every parent knows this conflict. And he says, Babylon will destroy Assyria and will defeat Egypt. The weak kings of Judah were saying it would make, if we make a treaty with powerful Egypt, then they will protect us against Babylon and Syria. And Jeremiah says Babylon's going to defeat Egypt. So it makes no difference whether you make a treaty or not. There's no use making a treaty with Egypt. You have to trust God. And that was the major problem. They didn't trust God enough. They didn't trust God at all. So often the Jews think the way to peace is to make a peace pact with people outside of Israel. And all through the Old Testament, God says that that's not the way to get peace. Israel has to look to God for peace. How relevant is that at the moment? Jeremiah says making pacts will not work and violence will rebound on you. And it did. Then in chapters 21 to 45, Jeremiah looks beyond all that to ultimate restoration when he realized that it is hopeless, that this disaster, it was going to come on them. He then gave them this longer term view of the ultimate restoration of his people again. And now it's mainly prose. Now it's mainly thoughts from God. When God talks about the immediate situation, it's his heart that he shows that's involved in it. But when he looks further afield, he's simply sharing his thoughts, his intentions for a long distance future, which are not so emotional. So in the long term, after Babylon has deported Judah and Jerusalem is devastated, some people will come back. And they will rebuild the temple and the city, and the situation is not totally lost. And then in chapters 46 to 51, they are all about the nations that surround Israel, the nations that have been a problem and that one day God will deal with. The restoration of Israel will be accompanied by the judgment of those who have caused the troubles. And that's how the God of justice operates in history. And chapter 52 is a sort of epilogue about this catastrophe which is breaking on Jeremiah's people. And this is written when it happens, as it's happening. And it describes Jeremiah and how he was taken away to Egypt and Jerusalem was left empty and devastated. Well, we have up to this point been looking at Jeremiah, at what Jeremiah has said, and what he said is the same sort of thing as the other prophets have said. But there are three things which he said which are completely unique to him. They are said in a way that other prophets do not speak. The first is his great emphasis on spiritual living. He says that religious ritual is worse than useless if your heart isn't in it. Some think that Jeremiah thought that the sacrificial offerings were a great waste of time. He wasn't exactly saying that. But what he was saying was the outward ritual of worship is not that important. What God is looking for is the heart behind it. If you are encouraged in spiritual activity, Jeremiah said, it doesn't matter whether your body is circumcised or not. It's whether your heart is circumcised. Excuse me. There's an emphasis on heart religion. the emphasis on getting the spirit of the law. And the priests were encouraging the idea that religious observation is somehow a substitute for godliness. Let's face it, anybody can sing a song. Anybody can go into a church and sing all the songs and raise their hands and do all the things that everybody else does. But it's what's in your heart that matters. It's what's in here that God sees. And it's that God was after. Now, when you've got professional priests and clergy and vicars and pastors and what have you, who are mostly concerned about how many people they can get into their church, you've got the same sort of thing, the same sort of situation, because that's not really what God is wanting. What God is wanting is godly living. And going to church is no substitute for godly living. You go to church once a week, maybe twice or 3 times a week. But God is after a godly life. And a godly life means living godly ways constantly, 24/7. And he says raising money for a new church roof is no substitute for a heart that wants to give to the poor. And Jeremiah puts this tremendous emphasis on spiritual aspect of religious life. He is a very spiritual man, and he's concerned with the human spirit. Now, he's preparing for them for the day when they will lose the temple and not be able to offer sacrifices, when the only thing they would have in Babylon would be not a temple but a synagogue. And the word synagogue is a Greek word, synagogue, which means to come together. Syn, together, and gogai, to come. So it's a lot of people coming together. But what could they come together for? They come together to let the priest offer sacrifices. Priests weren't going to be there, so they couldn't come together to let the priest offer sacrifices. Priests were going to be out of a job in Babylon, and all the priests were connected with the temple and the altars and the sacrifices. And this caused a massive change in the Jewish people's lives. But they could come together for 3 things: praising God, praying, and reading scriptures. This is basically the foundation for the church life in the New Testament. Because we don't have a temple. We don't have altars, and we don't have vestments, and we don't have incense, or priests, or sacrifices. We just have a table. We come together to praise and to pray and to read scriptures. Actually, synagogue worship became the platform for Christian worship. And the new religion was just a Christian synagogue. We don't need a high priest to do sacrifices. Jesus did that for us. And that's all obsolete now. The veil of the temple was torn in 2 because the curtains are taken down when the place is empty. So all the sacrificial ritual, all this sacrificial ritual we don't need and we don't have. And it tends to creep back if we're not careful, but we don't need it. But all the paraphernalia of the priesthood, the incense, the vestments, the altar, is now obsolete, as the letter to Hebrews tells us. What the Jews were going to have in Babylon is what we have now. Some might say we too are in exile. We are strangers, we are sojourners, we are disparate people, and we are just passing through. The real temple is with Jesus. It's not down here anymore. Our high priest has entered beyond the veil and taken the sacrifice of himself into the Holy of Holies. And so every church is now simply a Babylonian synagogue. The temptation from the very beginning has been to go back to the ritual of the temple. And we attempted to revert to the priests and the vestments and the altars and all these things. And Jeremiah was one of the men who liberated the Jews from all that, so that in Babylon they could survive without it and come together for prayer, praise and reading of God's word. So Jeremiah instigated all of that. Now, this is a unique emphasis in Jeremiah, and that's why he's called the spiritual prophet. He was setting them free for all the outward ritual, so that when they lost it, when it was taken away from them, they would remain the people of God. He was the only prophet who could foresee that, and they would have to find a new form of religion without the temple and all its paraphernalia. The next unique thing was that he really emphasized that in the new covenant, God is to deal with individuals, not with groups, not en masse, but rather he's going to make his covenant with each individual person. And that is a striking feature of the New Covenant. And it comes across a lot in the New Testament. And there's a real emphasis on each individual. God loved the world, and he sent his only begotten Son, that whoever, and that whoever is really important. And Jesus was constantly saying this, if any man follow me. Each one. That's the emphasis that's coming. Every individual man that follows me. But that's got to change. And through God's, though God is punishing them as a people, when they get back after the exile, God's going to deal with them all individually. So this is the Babylonian taking the Jews away from Israel, away from the temple and Jerusalem, is a turning point. It's at that point that God goes from being the God of this people to being the God of the individual. And he makes this statement just before he outlines the new covenant. And this is in Jeremiah 31:29. In those days, people will no longer say, the father has eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Instead, everyone will die for his own sin. Whoever eats sour grapes, his own teeth will be set on edge. Now that's a complete change. You notice in the Old Testament how God dealt with people corporately. And he said the sin of this generation could go on affecting to the third and fourth generation. And the father who sinned can cause his children to sin. No longer. At this point, this changes. In the new covenant, God will deal with each person individually for their own sin. And the New Testament has picked up on this. And the new covenant is an individual covenant with God, with each generation separately. God has no grandsons, and you can inherit you can't inherit a place in the new kingdom. You can't get in just because your parents are in. God deals with us on an individual basis. You need to come to him alone. Now that has profound implications for the Jews. Each individual must accept personal faith in the Lord, and they cannot, and they can't be, or they can't be in the kingdom. You can't be born into it, like being a Muslim. You're born into that. Being a Christian is different. You don't get born into being a Christian. You get a choice, and that's a choice for every individual to make. You can only be born again into it. So the implications of all this are very far-reaching. Ezekiel, who was to come after Jeremiah, would pick up on this same emphasis. He would say exactly the same thing, that each person would be judged for their own sin and nobody else's. And that is why we have in the New Testament on the day of judgment. You can't come as a group or a family or a church. You have to come on your own. And you're only answerable for your own sins. So we see here a great switch from God dealing with a people to dealing with the individual. It first sounded by Jeremiah, and then it's picked up by Ezekiel, and the whole of the New Testament is based on this understanding. The third unique emphasis is on the political side. More than any other prophet, more than Isaiah, Jeremiah gives political advice to the rulers of Israel, because when Israel is shrinking and about to disappear, they try to play off one superpower against another again and again. And Jeremiah said, it's no use you going to Egypt. It's no use you going to Egypt, because they aren't going to be able to help, and they aren't going to be able to protect you, because Babylon is going to defeat them as well. And it's not good fighting against Babylon, because God is sending them to take you, and you lose. Now, originally Jeremiah was all for fighting against Babylon, and he hated the Babylonians. Well, that hatred didn't really go from Jeremiah, but he'd been told by God that they've got to go willingly, otherwise there would be a mass slaughter and Jerusalem would be completely annihilated. And he's saying, my political advice is to cooperate with Babylon and get the best terms you can for surrender. Now, the last few kings of Israel, to suggest giving in to the enemy was tantamount to treason. Not even trying to defend the city was just unthinkable. And Jeremiah said, give in to them and you might preserve the city. But if you try and fight, the whole city will be destroyed. Say to the Babylonians, we don't mind living under you, but let's come to some terms. But they wouldn't listen, and his advice was turned down by a weak king after weak king. And he was called a traitor. He even said Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is coming as God's servant. Can you imagine in 1939 if somebody had stood up and said Adolf Hitler is coming as God's servant? Cooperate with him and get the best deal you can. The people would have been horrified, and they were horrified in Jeremiah's day. But that's the word that Jeremiah had to give. Not an easy word to give, because it looks like you're siding with Babylon. It looks like you're being a traitor to your own people. He advocated surrender to Babylon. That's when he put a yoke on his shoulders and he walked around Jerusalem and said, you must accept the yoke of Babylon. And before the Babylonians had come, that was a terrible message. Because it was saying, you've just got to accept the occupation. Well, those were the unique things that he said. And when the king of Babylon had actually came, he he offered to put Jeremiah on his honours list. You can quite imagine how the other Jews felt about that and about Jeremiah. And this led to the maltreatment of Jeremiah. You can understand this bad treatment at this time. But Jeremiah's bad treatment had started in his hometown right at the beginning when he was 17. And the first attempt to kill Jeremiah came from his own relatives in the village of Anathoth. And they plotted to assassinate him because it injured their family pride. This teenager was going around upsetting the whole of Jerusalem. And the whole family was angry with this young man. You're going to get us into trouble with the king, they said. God had a little word for him. And this little word was, I'm only training you up for worse. What a comfort. Well, at least God was honest. So, from then on, he was branded a traitor. He was rejected by the other prophets because they were false prophets. He was rejected by the priests because he spoke against the priest's job, the temple and their sacrifices. He was rejected by the princes because he was a political traitor. And he was rejected by the people. And there was one plot after another to assassinate him. And none of them succeeded. But more than once, he just escaped with his life. He was beaten and imprisoned by the priest, Pasha, and he was flung into a dimly lit dungeon. And at other occasions, he was placed with his hands and feet locked in the stocks and pilloried. He had an iron collar put on him, and finally he was put into a cistern. Now, a cistern is a kind of deep well shape with like a flask with a small neck, and it barrels out to keep water in. And once the water, the small neck was so that the water didn't evaporate. And once the water had been taken out of this cistern, it left mud and silt at the bottom of the well. Well, they took it into their heads to throw Jeremiah into the cistern. And he found himself up to his neck in this slime. Can you imagine being in near total darkness, buried up to your neck in mud? And he had to stand because if he'd sat, he'd have drowned in mud. Well, it was actually a foreigner who got Jeremiah out, and he let down a rope. He said, put it around you and under your elbows, and I'll pull you out. And this foreigner took pity on him and got him out of the cistern. A story not unlike the Good Samaritan. He was often in hiding there were few remaining in Jerusalem who would seek his advice. Finally, he was forcibly removed by the Jews who fled to Egypt when Babylon came, and there he died. His death is not in Scripture. He died in obscurity, little dreaming that he would become world famous and that we would be talking about him 2,500 to 3,000 years later. Now, it's because of all this that he's called the weeping prophet. And he wasn't a happy man, but would you be in that situation? I don't know whether I would be happy. And it's his misery that comes out again and again. And next week we'll look at a book in which he weeps from start to finish. It's written in tears, and it's called the Book of Lamentations. But even in the book itself, his miserable life comes out because he wasn't afraid to let us know. He prayed in those situations. He bared his soul, and he revealed his feelings, and he was deeply hurt. And this wasn't a thick-skinned man who didn't mind what people said about him. Jeremiah was a very sensitive guy, and he was deeply hurt because he was regarded as a traitor by his own family and his own people. And because all the prophets were against him and everybody else, everybody was against him. The loneliness that is what this man suffered. His physical sufferings were bad enough, but he felt not only trapped by man, but he also felt trapped by God. That was the real hurt, the real pain. He felt as if God had given him no choice. God had called him to this and shut him into it. And God had somehow trapped him into this ministry. And frankly, he says he resented this and he cried out to God against it. It's a mental and emotional suffering that came out of his rejection. One of the worst things was this. God said, I forbid you to marry Jeremiah, because if you did, you'd have to see your children starve when the Babylonians come. And so this was another way of getting his message across. He would say that I've not married because I'm not bringing my children into this world just to watch them suffer. That's a powerful message. But it also meant that he never had the companionship of a wife. God often uses prophets and their marriages to communicate the problem. For example, Hosea married a prostitute so that he could preach from that experience, and he felt how he felt about an unfaithful wife. And God told Ezekiel, your wife's going to die tomorrow, and you are not going to weep for her, because my wife's going to die, and I'm not weeping. These men were told that their life must reflect their message. And that's a hard thing to be told. It's a hard thing to bear out, your life reflecting your message. They had to live it out in this way. God was able to communicate his feelings to them. And Jeremiah was feeling very lonely and trapped. And he says when he feels most trapped, I know, O Lord, that a man's life is not his own. And it's not a man to direct his steps, for a man to direct his steps. So Jeremiah knew, and he'd effectively given his life to the Lord to do with as he wanted. And this is what the Lord needed done. Some of the most heart-rending passages, he cries out to God, you've given me a hopeless task. And one of these cries is widely quoted. He said, if I decide that I'll never talk about God again, there is a hidden fire in my bones. I am weary with forbearance, and I cannot contain it. And the poor man is saying, I'm never going to preach another sermon. And he says, but I can't stop myself. It's burning in my bones. I've got to let it out. And that's the trap he felt himself in. That he really had no choice, because his heart was burning for God. And even when he made the decision never to preach again, he just found himself automatically preaching again. He hadn't really been forced into it by God. God never forces people. But you can understand the anguish he felt in the situation. Afterwards, you can look back and say, well, it was all worth it. But at the time, it doesn't feel like that. But someone had to do it. But his prayer life is quite unique. The prayers of Jeremiah, there are about 7 all the way through, in which he's written down just how he talks to God. And the sheer honesty of the man, he is very, very honest. And he told God exactly what he was feeling. God knows how you feel inside anyway. So why tell him what's not true? You just show yourself to be a liar then. Argue with God like Habakkuk did. You won't win the argument, but God likes people to argue with him. He wants to know what you really think and how you really feel. And then he patiently and tenderly puts you right. When you study Jeremiah's life, with all his feelings of unhappiness and his feelings of being trapped into this ministry, in all the isolation and loneliness of having everybody hating you and being against you, and not being able to have a wife to stand by you, in all that this man prays to God, and he had it all out with God honestly. This smacks of a true relationship. Even though he went through all these things, he still had a fire in his belly for God. And that's an amazing testimony. Even though you're hated by your people, you're hated by your family, people want to kill you for what you're saying, and yet you just cannot stop yourself because you've got such a fire in your belly for God. I admire Jeremiah. He's one of the prophets that I come back to time and time again. He's quite an incredible person. And even though he suffered all this loneliness and sadness, the fire never was extinguished. And that's a testament to the power and the trust you have in God. Well, next time we'll focus on the Book of Lamentations. Have a great day, and God bless you. Bye.